Humans have been interested in how language works since we started using it. The first written discussions about the nature of language and sound, however, come from classical antiquity. In his work Cratylus, Plato wrestles with the forms of words not being inherently linked to what they refer to. Around the same time, Panini was writing his descriptive grammar of Sanskrit. He constructed sets of rules to account for different parts of the grammar and to explain the workings of language. He's still a big deal over 2,000 years later. I even cited Panini in my 2018 dissertation. As we began to look at the nature of language, it wouldn't take too long for people to start inventing their own languages and trying to push the boundaries of what natural language can do. You might already know of languages created solely for art, science fiction, and film. People usually bring up the language in Avatar or the languages in Game of Thrones, but did you know the practice of inventing a language expands quite a bit beyond art? It has a place in science, philosophy, and global communication. People use these languages to practice religion, to play with philosophy, to test scientific hypotheses, to flesh out fictional worlds, and to lay the groundwork for world peace. Welcome to my wheelhouse. We're talking about linguistics today, friends. Quick disclaimer, this isn't an instructional video and you won't be expected to know any linguistics. I've linked a few videos and books about language construction in the description for those of you eager conlangers. Instead, I want to get into the reason why people construct a language, their goals, and the questions that arise. Ready? Okay, let's get started. Engineered languages are those that are designed to meet objective criteria, like eliminating all ambiguity, achieving maximal simplicity, or testing a philosophy or linguistic theory. They're often created for a specific purpose and aren't necessarily complete or intended for people to learn them as a second language. They help us learn about the limits of language and how we interact with language in the first place. To the lab, scientists! There are these very cool linguistic experiments that test the limits of natural language and the human mind in general. In a paper from 2019, for example, Dr. Brandon Prickett trained participants on a small artificial alien language to test how humans do when sound changes interact. Some background for you. Sounds are often pronounced differently in different contexts. Have you ever noticed that the F in hoof changes to a V when it's made plural? It becomes hooves. Sometimes sounds change to be easier to pronounce, easier to hear, or because the language in question has a special rule about what can or cannot occur. We don't tend to notice these changes, but we do them very consistently when using language. Multiple sound changes happen in the same language, and when multiple changes apply to the same word, they interact and can affect one another. Let's look at two common changes, vowel deletion and palatalization. Don't panic, I know palatalization is an unsettling word at first. I'm about to explain, and I am equipped with the International Phonetic Alphabet. First, vowel deletion means that if there are two vowels next to each other, delete one of them. In this case, delete the first one. There can only be one. Palatalization, or literally become palatal, refers to a sound changing to be pronounced at the middle of the roof of your mouth, otherwise known as your hard palate. This happens before an E sound. T, for example, shifts backwards from having the tongue near your top teeth towards the hard palate. This changes it into a ch sound. Look at what happens if we apply these changes to different strings of sounds. First, we've got a T followed by an A and an E. If vowel deletion applies first, this puts T and E next to each other. This means that palatalization gets to apply because vowel deletion applies. Linguists call this feeding. If we look at a different string, the TIA, vowel deletion will still apply, but this time the E deletes and cuts off any possibility of palatalization applying. Linguists call this bleeding. Feeding and bleeding are called transparent interactions. It's easy to see what's happening by just following down the order of the changes. Things get murky when we look at what happens if you ask what if. If we change the order of the rules, the final results won't make sense for the language at first glance. For TAI, palatalization doesn't apply because T isn't next to I. Then vowel deletion applies, the first vowel leaves, and T is next to I. But we've already skipped past palatalization, so it can't apply. It leaves a very unexpected TI sequence at the end. With the rules in the language, I wouldn't expect to see those sounds next to each other. We call this counterfeeding. It has an unexpected result, and it would be a feeding relationship if switched. The same kind of thing happens for TIA. Palatalization applies first, T becomes ch because it's next to I. Then vowel deletion deletes the I because it's first. So at the end, we get a palatalized sound before a vowel that's not I. The thing that caused the change isn't there anymore. That's an unexpected result, and it would be a bleeding interaction if the order was reversed. We call this counterbleeding. Weird, right? They are called opaque interactions for obvious reasons. Now that we know about transparent and opaque interactions, let's get back to Prickett and alien languages. Past research has proposed that humans prefer as many changes to apply as possible, and for transparent interactions over opaque interactions. He created a small artificial language based on the 4 kinds of interactions. He wanted to test to confirm the biases that had been proposed, and to test whether these biases arise due to how human brains learn or some kind of built-in or innate preference. 48 native English speakers were asked to receive training on an alien language and answer questions about what you've learned. They completed a training section which presented different full-size pictures of common and easy-to-identify things like fruits and vegetables, animals, and body parts, with audio recordings and text of the corresponding alien word below. They would then see the same picture but smaller, doubled, or both. The participant then has to sort 2 audio files, the one that they just heard for the singular tomato, and the new form that means it's now a tiny diminutive tomato, 2 tomatoes, or 2 tiny tomatoes. They learned the pattern by trial and error and getting feedback as to if their answers were right or wrong. The alien words are made up of 72 different stems, all of which end in T, D, G, or K. They can be suffixed with singular I, diminutive A, or both. The order of these suffixes when together depends on which interaction is currently being tested. Essentially, the task forces the choice between palatalizing or not, deleting or not, or choosing the incorrect order of the changes. The training and test phases covered all 216 possible alien words and all 4 interaction types. The results confirm both biases that had been proposed. We like it when all the possible changes apply, and we prefer transparent interactions. That's not all, though. Prickett then compared those results to how well computer learning models could do the same task. They largely performed the same. Humans alone showed a slight preference for counterfeeding over counterbleeding and deleting cases, but this isn't due to either bias. Prickett thinks it's likely because the alien language sometimes accidentally included real English words once all the changes took place. The participants' grammar of English might have taken over in some cases. Luckily, this kind of noise doesn't affect the main questions in the study. In the end, it seems like our biases come from how our brains work. A computer model does the exact same thing. These kinds of experiments drive science forward, test existing models and assumptions, and highlight the strengths and limits of the human brain. We need to know what's possible and impossible, and this is one way to do it. It's important to note that these artificial alien languages used in experiments are not complete languages that you could learn and use. They are designed for the purposes of the study, and that's it. Other engineered languages try to answer much wider-ranging questions and garner communities of learners, fellow scientists, and philosophers. And when you create a community, you're going to have beautiful ideas grow and change, and disagreements and dramatic splits. Dr. James Cook Brown was an American sociology professor who set out to create a language he called Loglan. He intended to investigate the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or the idea that the language one speaks somehow influences or restricts our perception and how we interact with the world. Remember, there will be an entire video dedicated to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis on this channel soon. Loglan was to be a culturally neutral language that is entirely regular and unambiguous, prioritizing logic and simplicity. Every sentence means exactly one thing. There is no room for interpretation. The number of sounds were even restricted to minimize the opportunity for regional accents to develop. The idea was to create a language that would be so different from natural languages that people learning it would begin to think differently, more logically. If the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is true, then Loglan should be successful in changing the minds and hearts of its users. Brown isn't testing human brains for what changes are and aren't possible. He's proposing to change how people think. When we start to make big generalizations or poke at things like the very nature of humanity, it's best practice to look at who is doing the poking. So who is James Cook Brown? Originally born in the Philippines in 1921, Brown was 8 years old when he moved with his mother to Minnesota. He'd grow up there and ultimately leave to serve as a combat navigator in the Army Air Forces in England during World War II. After returning from the war, he attended the University of Minnesota for his bachelor's in philosophy and mathematics in 1946. followed by a PhD in sociology, philosophy, and mathematics statistics in 1952. Over the next 3 years, he'd spend some time in Mexico, where he wrote and published several pieces of science fiction in magazines. He did a stint in research analytics and advertising while he developed a board game called Careers that actually saw a bit of success. Players try to reach a certain amount of fame, happiness, and fortune to win the game. The game includes tracking annual salary, you can get degrees for raises, and you can enter different occupations and get random opportunities. Brown intended the game to demonstrate that being successful in life can take many forms. He began teaching sociology at the University of Florida in Gainesville in 1955. It's here that he begins to develop Loglan. He introduces the language in Scientific American in 1960. He received a grant the next year to develop the language, and he left teaching in 1961 to pursue Loglan full-time with his wife Lou Joy Fuller. Outside of his Loglan work, he began work in social activism. He was arrested and jailed in 1963 for participating in a sit-in to protest a restaurant's whites-only policy. He'd later be just as loudly opposed to the Vietnam War. He simply did a lot of stuff. He published a science fiction novel called The Troika Incident in 1970 that dreamed up the internet and Kindles decades before either existed in any real way, and he built his own trimaran and sailed all over the world. I could read several books about this guy. Anyway, what about the actual language? Brown founded the Loglan Institute, also known as TLI, in order to develop the language and steer research and applications of it. Words were constructed to have elements in common with the world's 8 most widely spoken languages at the time: English, Mandarin, Hindi, Russian, Spanish, Japanese, French, and German. These languages are spoken by 1.7 billion people, either as a first or second language. The idea was that basing the language on these would allow for easier learning for most people in the world, regardless of their language background. The languages were ranked, and their influence in the language is limited according to the number of speakers. By the numbers, English and Mandarin were the most spoken, with 53% of the group. Words are constructed based on finding learnable words, where most people will find matching sound sequences from their native languages. Brown calculated the probabilities of both A, speakers being from a certain language background, and B, if they could learn the Loglan word because they had a similarly sounding word in their language. For certain words, you might expect most speakers will likely learn the word well enough given a similar word in their own language. For example, the word blue in Loglan is blanu. An English speaker will likely reference blue and remember the new word rather easily. Same for blau in German. Blue for French, or even Nila in Hindi gives you the N. But a Japanese speaker doesn't have the same kind of related word to reference to. It's going to take good old memorizing for them. Brown and the Institute spent the next 20 or so years developing, tweaking, and studying Loglan. The language appears in a few science fiction pieces aside from Brown's own The Troika Incident. Loglan is featured in that novel, but it was called Panland instead. It was also referenced in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress and The Number of the Beast by Robert A. Heinlein, Love Me Tomorrow by Robert Rimmer, and His Master's Voice by Stanislav Lem. It's even the official interspecies language in the space-based role-playing game FTL 2248. There was a rift in the Loglan community, however, when Brown started to claim legal restrictions and copyright on the language's components. Bans on changing Loglan were put into place. In response, a group of users split off and formed the Logical Language Group, or LLG. Keeping many of the same goals and structures, the LLG reinvented the entire vocabulary based on 6 languages instead of 8 and named the new language Lojban. It also incorporated a set of words about how the speaker knows information from another invented language called La'adan. That language is designed to be a feminist language testing Sapir-Whorf 2. They began development of Lojban in 1987 and published the complete Lojban language in 1997. There was a 5-year freeze on changes to the language, and in 2002 it opened up to the public for changes, new words, and to decide where the language heads. In the years since, the logical language community has continued to develop new words and sayings and put the language into use. The Loglan-Lojban distinction is still a sore spot in the community, but many will often group them together into a single language family of sorts. They are built on the same principles, but the actual languages are different. Brown continued his work on Loglan, but Lojban was building momentum. There is still an active Loglan Institute. Though largely defunct from 1996, current CEO Randall Holmes breathed new life into the Institute in 2013. In addition to a mailing list, they host a Discord server dedicated to the language and conversational groups on Second Life. The developers of Lojban saw other applications for the language in the future beyond the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Lojban could also be used for education, as an academic or scientific language, as a potential means means of machine translation and as a tool to explore the intersection between human language and software. While Brown later claimed to have noticed differences in how he thought using Loglan, there haven't been any studies showing changes in brain chemistry or how people think. Regardless of altering brain structure, Lojban is here and growing. According to Arika Okrent, the author of In the Land of Invented Languages, Lojban is the constructed language with the most complete grammar. There is an active international community continuing to develop and spread news of the language. The last in-person annual meeting seems to have been in 2015, but there are numerous active projects developing and spreading word of Lojban to different communities across the world. Lojban is not the first language intended to foster international communication. When a language is created for that very purpose, it's called an international auxiliary language. Instead of being built to test certain ideas, however, they mean to build a new international culture and community based on peace. The invention doesn't just stop at the language, but that's a story for part 2.